Welcome back, and thank you for being here virtually tonight. Tonight, we hope to learn from the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th Mishnas, and we'll see how that goes, if we can get through all of that. So we'll jump right into it. So we're starting with Mishna Zayin, Mishnah number 7, and there it says Nitai ha'arbeli omer. Nitai from Arbel says, if we backtrack to the previous Mishnah, so the previous one, Vav, number 6, had said that Yehoshua ben Prachya, Yehoshua the son of Prachya, and Nitai from Arbel were the next recipients of the tradition. In the previous Mishnah, I had the teaching of Yehoshua ben Prachya, and now this Mishnah has the teaching of Nitai ha'arbeli. So what did Nitai ha'arbeli have to say? What was his go-to teaching? So 3 things. Number 1, harchek mishachen ra. Distance yourself from an evil neighbor. A shachen is a neighbor, or ra means bad or evil. Distance yourself from a bad neighbor. Ve'al tischaber larasha, and don't join. Chaver, actually, somebody said the word chavrusa before, and a chaver in Hebrew is a friend. So tischaver is the verb to befriend and to attach. Really, chibur means attached. So al tischaber larasha, don't attach yourself to a wicked person. Ve'al tisyaesh min puranus, and literally do not give up on or abandon retribution, the faith in retribution, the belief in retribution. What that means is very unclear. And here in this translation, they put the word divine in brackets there, meaning divine retribution. But what does that even mean? Don't abandon faith in divine retribution. Pretty enigmatic statement. But those are the 3 go-to lines of Nitai ha'arbeli. Number 1, distance yourself from a bad neighbor. Number 2, do not attach yourself or befriend a rasha, a wicked person. And number 3, do not abandon faith in pur anus, retribution. What is the difference between a shachen ra, a bad neighbor, and a rasha, a wicked person? Why doesn't it say distance yourself from a rasha and don't befriend a rasha, or just don't say anything? Why do we need 2 statements here? Distance yourself from a bad neighbor and do not join with a rasha. Do not befriend a rasha. Now, what's the difference and which one's worse? Who is worse? The shachen ra, the bad neighbor, or the rasha, the wicked person? Who is worse? So different commentaries will actually take differing approaches to this. The Midrash Shmuel quotes from what he calls the Mefarshim, the commentators, and he says that whoever he is quoting, the commentators, they assumed that the rasha, the wicked person, is worse than a bad neighbor. A rasha is like a stamp of this person is a rasha, this person is wicked. So that's worse. So he says, if that's true, so we have a bad neighbor and then we have a rasha. So it says, distance yourself from the bad neighbor and don't befriend the rasha. Well, if the rasha is worse, if a wicked person is worse, then why are we so lax about it? We're saying if they're a bad neighbor, you gotta distance yourself. You've gotta get up and go far away, right? If it's a rasha, don't worry. Just don't make friends with him. You don't have to move. You don't have to get up and distance yourself. Just stay put. Just don't attach yourself to him or her. Don't befriend them. He says, why is it like that? Shouldn't it be the opposite? Right? If somebody's a real wicked person, you should be far away. It should say you should distance yourself from a wicked person, and somebody who's a bad neighbor, don't be friends with them. So why the other way? So Midrash Shmuel suggests as follows. He says again, Midrash Shmuel is Reb Shmuel de Uzida, 16th century, I think we said, Sfas, and he's our go-to for this class, this series. And he says as follows. He says, there's no question here. It doesn't bother me, he says, because when somebody is truly wicked, so then we don't need to be told to distance ourselves from them. A person whose deeds are wicked, plain to see, out in the open, obviously wicked, so then we naturally despise that, we disdain that, we'll naturally distance ourselves from that, and and we're less likely to be entrapped by him, to even befriend. But there's not as much of a need of a warning to distance ourselves. We're not as susceptible to learning from such a person's ways. However, a person who is not as bad, what here it refers to as a bad neighbor, but someone who, let's say, it's not so obvious that they are a bad influence on us. It's not as clear. And we may not even realize necessarily, unless we think about it, consider the relationship a bit more. Is this a good relationship for me? Or is this a bad relationship? Is this a good neighbor, a good friend to have? Is this a bad friend? If we don't think about it, we may not even realize the influence that someone is having on us. So that's the person that we have to, the Mishnah says, Nitai Harbeli says, you have to distance yourself from that person, because we're much more susceptible to someone who seems okay, isn't as obviously a bad influence as the Rasha. So the Rasha, the wicked person, it just says, don't get too close. But and the person will naturally distance themselves from him. We don't need to be told to distance ourselves. However, for the bad neighbor, for someone who's not as obviously wicked, not as obviously a bad influence, so that's a person that we need to be told, stay away from them. If not, we're going to be entrapped. We're going to be influenced if we remain close to them. And like I was saying, it's an important idea to be aware of. We have to just, again, we have to be nice. We have to be courteous, but we also have to be careful, and we have to take stock of our relationships, and who it is that we end up spending time with, our social group, whatever it might be, and consider, is this a good place for me? Is this a place where I am positively influenced or negatively influenced? And if it's a place that we are negatively influenced, then maybe a different social group might be better. Harcheik mishachein ra, distance ourselves from bad neighbors. And the point here isn't to start judging people and examining people. In fact, we'll talk about it, but the commentaries kind of have to balance this Mishnah with the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah we just left off, and there may be that connection here. The previous Mishnah was, you should judge everybody favorably. You should judge everybody favorably. And now we're saying, distance yourself. So we'll get more into that. So again, we're not supposed to start judging every little thing, but it's important also to maintain our spiritual level, our level of observance, our level of connection, is to be aware of what kind of influences are within reach of us, and to think about maybe sometimes we need to make more distance in those relationships which are not as positive. And then we have this difficult line in the Mishnah that says, don't give up from pur anus. Don't abandon retribution, or don't abandon faith in retribution. So Midrash Shmuel says that here the word pur anus kind of means like, it comes from the Hebrew or Aramaic word pareya, which means to pay back. The retribution here is payment. So he actually says that the word over here is referring to sins. It means our iniquities, our sins. That is what is referred to as pur anus. So it's not literally a payment or a punishment here. It's more the idea of like a bad experience. So you can have a bad experience come in the form of a punishment. You can have a bad experience come in the form of a sin. So that's how he interprets it. And he says that a person might think, I've secured all my relationships. I've made sure to distance myself from bad neighbors. I have made sure not to be friends with any wicked people. So I'm safe from sin. I'm protected in that way. So the Mishnah, Nitai Harbeli, puts out a third statement. He says, but still, don't be overly confident in your security in terms of your observance of mitzvos, but rather don't abandon the possibility that you could still sin. Meaning, be aware, protect yourself from that, and don't just assume, okay, I don't have to worry, I'll be just fine. A person has to be on continuous guard to make sure that their behavior continues to be on track, and a person can never give up on that or abandon it or ignore it, but a person has to try to always be on a path of growth. It's not enough just to distance ourselves from negative influences, but we also have to work on positive growth. So don't just give up, don't abandon the possibility of sin because we've protected ourselves from negative influences. We still have to work on a path of growth. That's the first approach here to this Mishnah. Now, another explanation that he brings is as follows. Distance yourself from a bad neighbor and don't befriend a Rasha. Who is this bad neighbor and who is this Rasha? Who is this wicked person? So he says, you can have a person who in certain ways is very righteous. Let's call them very frum, right? They're very spiritually connected. They pray and they study Torah, but sometimes such a person did that, but maybe they didn't do it for the right reasons. However it plays out, they haven't really perfected their character, and they're just not a good neighbor. They're not nice to their neighbors. So even though it seems in a certain way they're very spiritual, they're very observant, but they still could be a bad neighbor. And they start up fights and arguments and the like. It has happened before. So such a person, the Mishnah says, distance yourself from them, even if they have certain good traits. But if they're a bad neighbor, then they start fights, they start arguments, then one should put some distance between oneself and that neighbor. So then you go to the other end. So you finally found a good neighbor. He's a great neighbor. He treats all the neighbors really nicely. He's generous, right? He seems to have all good traits. At least that's how it is when he engages with other people. But this neighbor is, on the other hand, someone who does not live a moral life on the inside, inside closed doors. So he's a great neighbor. His lawn is always mowed, he shares his tools with his neighbors, right? He's a wonderful neighbor, but he doesn't live a moral life. So you might think, well, what does that have to do with me? Why does that bother me? He does what, or she does what they do. They live the life that they live indoors in their home, and I just live next door, and we can get along that way. So to that, the Mishnah says that it's not so simple. Even if he or she is a good neighbor and they're generous, but they don't live a more morally upright way of living. So the Mishnah says, do not befriend such people. Do not become close with such people, because you might think you're safe from their influence, but because that immoral activity goes on indoors, we don't see it. It's only out, we only see them as good neighbors. So the Mishnah warns, but still, a person has to guard themselves from that they are still susceptible to influence from such people, and therefore also do not befriend such people. So on the one hand, it says distance yourself from a bad neighbor. You can have a person who in certain ways seems very righteous, very observant, right? But very connected, but they're not a nice neighbor, and they start arguments. So that's not someone who one should be getting close with. Distance yourself from that person. It's not a good relationship to have. On the other hand, you can have a very good neighbor. Great family, they're so nice, but they don't live a morally upstanding way of living. So then also to them, we should distance ourselves and realize that we are still susceptible to influence for them. And then again, that's the closing line there of don't give up on puranus. Again, here, according to this, we'll translate puranus as sins, iniquities. Don't abandon the possibility that they will have an influence on us, and influence us to sin and influence us to live a less moral way of life. So again, it's all, it's just so far two ways to read the Mishnah, but they both have to do with a awareness that we are susceptible to influence. This is a very important idea for us to always understand. I think at times we think that we're impervious to any influence from those around us, and there's no such thing. In fact, Maimonides, the Rambam, he writes that it's a person's nature to be influenced by the society around them, by the people around them. That's natural. To be able to go against the grain, so to speak, if the people in our community or in our neighborhood or in our city, whatever it is, that in our world, if people act in a certain manner and accept certain ideals, it impacts us, it affects us, and naturally we're influenced by that. And so when those are good influences, then great. When those are negative influences, then we have to realize that we are susceptible to that and do what we can to avoid them. Yeah, Jill, you can unmute.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, one second. Jill has her hand up, her Zoom hand.
Yep.
Tell her to go first. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm still very confused with the whole idea of the way you're expressing the poranut. And also, I'm not sure where in this Mishnah the word faith is coming in, and what does that mean in this translation? Are you just like sort of avoiding that word, or it's not really there? Or
Yeah, it's the word faith is not actually there in the Hebrew.
Okay.
We'll see. I don't remember as I go through. I guess I'll see if any of the explanations that we'll bring will use that word. But for now, you can ignore the word faith and retribution. But
Okay.
But the word puranus, right? There's different ways to translate it, basically. So as I said, the word means like, it literally means payment, but sometimes we use it to mean like difficult situations, tragic situations. So I think that's where they're taking and saying it refers to sin, to something that really bad that happens, basically. So you can have a really bad event in a person's life. That's the idea of retribution, a punishment. But so far, we're just translating it as sin. Don't give up on the idea that we can be influenced to sin. Okay, Ali.
The part about don't befriend a person whose morals are not good ones. Are we talking about morals and ethics, or are we talking about being frum and shomer Shabbos?
Right. So that's a good question. So I think that in different societies that will take on a different meaning. So definitely in our society, I think we will be talking about morals and ethics. I think in a society where that was, let's say, ancient, in the times of the Mishna, where everybody was living a certain way, and for somebody to break from that on their own and they weren't raised that way, and it was that was considered like a really bad thing, against the grain, right? So if somebody's going against somebody lives and is brought up in a Torah society, and you don't have different parts and different influences the way that we do nowadays. It's very different. So in the times of the Mishnah, it could refer to somebody, any type of person who's not following the laws of Torah. I think nowadays it's different. Nowadays we have an understanding that people are raised in very different situations, and we wouldn't say to not befriend someone because that's how they grew up, and that's how they live. But if somebody is doing something that everybody agrees is immoral, and it's obvious is immoral, that's, I think, in our society, what we would be talking about.
Thank you.
Okay. Next Mishnah. Okay, so continuing on. So as I referenced before, we just came from the Mishnah, which these two Mishnahs, this number 7 and number 6, are kind of pairs, because it said that Yehoshua ben Prachya and Itai Harbeli were the next recipients of the tradition, and Yehoshua ben Prachya taught a few things. Among them, you should be dan lakaf zechus. We should judge others favorably. And now we're turning around and we're saying, Nitai Harbeli is saying, well, distance yourself from bad neighbors, don't join with the wicked. So is he arguing? So Midrash Shmuel says that it's possible that he's just coming to set the record in a way. And we mentioned this last week, that when we say that we should judge others favorably, it really doesn't mean anybody. If somebody has a record of being wicked, we're not going to start judging them favorably. If it wouldn't be good for us, it wouldn't be good for society to just assume that the worst villains in society, no, they're not so bad. They stole because of this and that. Like, that's not very helpful, right? So what Nitai Harbeli is coming to add is that even though my good friend Yehoshua ben Prachya, my partner in passing on the tradition, said to judge everyone favorably, so he didn't really mean everyone. If that were the case, if we did that, so that would cause destruction in our society. Everybody would befriend the worst villains, and they would be influenced by them. They'd join the gangs, etc., and the end would not be good. And we judge them favorably. No, really, he's very righteous, but we can explain why he does all these terrible things by justifying them. That wouldn't be good for ourselves or for our society. So therefore, he comes here and he says that when it comes to the wicked, you have to recognize wicked for what wicked is, and distance ourselves from such behaviors. And then he adds in this interpretation, I don't know if, I don't see the connection, but that the last line, don't abandon faith in Pur Anus, the way that he interprets it is that even if a person is in a very difficult situation, don't abandon faith. So we have this concept, we talked about it when we learned about tefillah, fundamentals of prayer, that even when a person, it's the worst of situations, the expression of the Talmud is even if a person has a sword against their neck. So still, it looks like it's over. Don't give up. Don't abandon faith. It could always turn around. So I don't know how that would connect to the previous teaching. It would, maybe we could think about. But in this approach, he's saying that Nitai Harbeli comes along to set the record straight. Yoshua ben Prachia had said, judge everybody favorably. Nitai Harbeli comes, not quite. We shouldn't always judge everyone favorably. It depends on the person. If they are established and known to be immoral, then one should not judge them favorably. And otherwise, we open ourselves up to negative influence. And then he throws in that also one should never give up hope. There's always, even if things look really bad, there's always hope. Another possibility. A person who lives a righteous life, he might see, or she might see, that the wicked are successful. The wicked are living the good life. And this is of course, a common question that people have. Why do the good suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? These are not new questions. These are questions that are brought up in the Talmud. The Talmud says that Moses asked it of God. It's questions that if you read through Tehillim, through Psalms, King David is asking them over and over again, these questions. They're not new questions, but it's somewhat of a classic question of kind of looking at the world and not that we don't understand. And he says, therefore, someone who lives a good life, lives a moral life, an upstanding moral life, may look at others and say, why, if they live that way, why are they successful and I am not? And they might even come to regret the life and the way that they've lived. And that will be terrible, just because they see others are successful and they're not. And by successful, I just mean comfortable and not suffering, right? There's different forms of success, of course. What's a successful life? But they see others living a good life and they have it difficult. They might start to regret what they've done. And therefore comes Nitai Harbeli, and he says that you might therefore want to get close with such people. You see that they're successful despite their immoral way of life. I want to be a part of that. I want to join, live up the good life, live for pleasure. And Nitai Harbeli says, no, distance yourself from such people. He doesn't go into the difference between, and in this explanation, the difference between a bad neighbor and a wicked person. Just don't join with them. Don't befriend them just because it looks like they're living the good life and it's difficult for you. Rather, and also don't give up on, don't abandon Pur Anus. Again, we have this word that the way that now he's interpreting it is don't give up because of Pur Anus. Don't give up because of suffering. A person sees suffering in their life and they say, I give up. I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. It's not worth it. So Nitai Harbeli says, don't say that. Don't give up. It is worth it. And a person should never give up. And we don't understand God's ways. We don't always understand, but we shouldn't give up and we should keep doing what is good and right. And don't say, oh, but the wicked, they live such a good life, let me join them. No, don't go and join them, and don't give up because of suffering. One more approach. And in this approach, I think we flip from what we said originally. This is quoted, he quotes it from Rav Moshe al-Mushnino. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but he poses the question we posed at the beginning. Why by the bad neighbor does it say distance yourself from the bad neighbor? And by the wicked person, it says do not befriend them, don't join them. So he says that if the wicked person is reaching out to join a good person, if somebody wicked reaches out to you and wants to befriend you, so then, since it's coming from them, that's okay to accept, he says. Then you can let them in. You can let them into your life. You can allow them to become your friend. And that's because if they are reaching out to you, that puts you in the upper, gives you the upper hand in the relationship. You'll be more influential to them because obviously they need you. They desire this relationship. Often it could mean that they see something good and that they in you, and they want to be a part of that. They regret their way of life. They want to join. They want to be a part of something better, and so they reach out. So if it's coming from the wicked person, the desire for friendship, he says, then you can accept them. However, and right, if you accept them, then there's the chance that you'll help them turn their life around. Then you should accept them, and that's a great mitzvah. It's a great thing. But the other way is what the Mishna is warning us about. Nitai Arbeli says we shouldn't try to befriend the wicked. That puts the wicked person in the upper position, right? It makes us seem desperate for the relationship. It puts the wicked person in the upper position, allows them to, we need them, and that means that we're more susceptible to influence from them, and then that's that's not where we want to be. So that's why it says don't befriend the wicked. You shouldn't be the initiator. In this approach, I don't think he ends up addressing the part about the bad neighbor. The bad neighbor just says distance yourself from, but in terms of the wicked person, he says that it specifically says don't befriend them, meaning you should not initiate a friendship with someone who is wicked. That puts them in a stronger position to influence you. But if they initiate, then you can welcome the friendship, because that means that you have an opportunity to positively influence them. Okay, so basically, just to sum it up, I think we said 4 or 5 different explanations. Number 1 was that we should distance ourselves from a bad neighbor and do not befriend the wicked. So we're told distance ourselves from a bad neighbor because somebody who's not obviously wicked, we're more susceptible to their influence. Somebody who's wicked, we're not going to learn from them. We see it for what it is. They won't really influence us. So we'll naturally distance ourselves. We don't have to be told to distance ourselves from such a person. But somebody who just a bad neighbor, it's not as obvious. So there we're more susceptible to influence. Therefore it says distance ourselves from such a person. Or alternatively, we said that you can have a person who seems very righteous, but they're a bad neighbor. Distance ourselves from such a person. You can have a person who's a great neighbor, but lives an immoral life. We should not befriend such a person. again, because they can have an influence on us, we said that Nitai Har Baby here is coming to kind of set things straight with the teaching of Yoshua ben Prachia that said, judge everybody favorably. He's saying, not quite, not everybody. There are times where we have to call a spade, and if the person is clearly and openly wicked, then we should not start judging them favorably. That would be bad for us and bad for society. And then we said that a person might see that the wicked prosper, the good, the righteous suffer, and therefore they will regret living a righteous lifestyle. They'll want to join the wicked, join with the immoral, and that he warns, don't do that, and don't give up just because one experiences suffering. And then this last point that we said was that if the relationship is being initiated by the other side, by the person, the wicked person, well, that's actually a sign that they may want to change. They want to connect with somebody who lives a more righteous lifestyle. Then we are allowed to accept their friendship. We have the upper hand in that relationship and are more likely to influence them, as opposed to if we're the initiator. So then, if we're in need of the relationship, that puts them in the upper hand and leaves us susceptible to being influenced by them. I think one just final important point here is that, we always want to be, like we said, we always want to be nice to others, and we always want to be able to positively influence others. But we have to, besides that, we have to recognize the negative influence that someone can have on us, which is important, but we also have to realize kind of the limits of where we can have an impact. There's of course, nobody is ever too far gone, but there are people who they're very distant and live a very different lifestyle, and especially if they're not initiating, it's so unlikely to get anywhere, and the risks don't necessarily outweigh the potential benefit, which is so distant and so unlikely. So we have to just take stock and be aware of that when choosing who we want to connect to, who we want to try to impact. The person is so distant, then it's not necessarily worth it and could have negative impact instead. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. So Mishnah Ches, Mishnah number 8. Yehuda ben Tabai, the Shimon ben Shetach Kibul Mehem. The next two to receive the tradition were Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach. Yehuda ben Tabai Omer. Yehuda ben Tabai said, Al tas atzmecha ke'orchei hadayanim. You should not make yourself, actually it's in the second person, you should not make yourself like orchei hadayanim. Dayanim are judges. Orchei means the arrangers. Here they translate as an advocate. In this translation, they assume it's talking to the judge and saying the judge should not become an advocate for any of the litigants, right? A judge should not become a lawyer, basically. That's how they translate it. We'll go through a number of different approaches, but that's how they translate it. And when the litigants are standing before you, again, talking to a judge clearly, we should view them both as wicked, equally wicked. But when they leave the courtroom, you should view them both as meritorious. When? When they have accepted the judgment of the court. So, number one, do not make yourself like orchei hadayanim, the arranger or the advocate for justice or for the judge. And when the litigants are standing in front of you, they should be like wicked in your eyes. And when they leave, we should think of them only as meritorious when they've accepted judgment. So on its face, this Mishnah is speaking to a judge, as is the next Mishnah. And some of the things that we already mentioned in the past also seem to be talking to a judge. It's interesting, right? Is Pirkei Avos about judges? It's not what we assume. It happens to be that Pirkei Avos finds itself in the order of Mishnah in the section of Nizikin, of torts. So it follows actually after, not directly after, but pretty close after Sanhedrin, which talks about court systems. So it may be that Avos, this tractate is where we slip in some of the more ethical ideas, not just for people in general, but for judges, because that's kind of the context. But we'll talk about this first as if it's about a judge. But since I don't think any of us are judges, as far as I know, we'll try to also, certainly not in a rabbinical court, we'll also try to see if there's application for us as well. Beyond, there are lessons we can take from what it's telling the judges, but maybe there's other ways to read this. So number one is that the Midrash Shmuel brings an interpretation as follows. There's a concept in Jewish law when litigating a case or when two people are involved in a dispute and they want to go to a Jewish court, to a Beis Din. So there's a concept that, there could be multiple courts. How do they choose where to go to court? So actually what happens is, or what could happen is that one of the litigants gets to choose one judge, with certain rabbi for the rabbinical court. The other one can choose a second judge. And then those two judges that have been chosen convene to choose a third judge. And that way it's fair because both of the litigants have been able to choose their guy. Now it has to be someone who is worthy of that, seemingly. But naturally, though, if they're getting to choose, there could be a little bit of a bias from the judge who has been chosen. So one possible interpretation is that the Mishnah is warning the judge. In this interpretation, we're going to translate the words orchei hadayanin. Don't make yourself like orchei hadayanin, not as the word advocate, but orech means to arrange. So as those who arrange the judges, meaning the litigants. So it tells the judges, don't see yourself as the representative of the litigant, even though he's the one that chose you. He's the arranger of the judge, the orchei hadayanin, the arrangers of the judge. Don't see yourselves as the arrangers of the judge, but rather you have to try to judge in an unbiased manner. That's both litigants have to be equal in your eyes, even though one of them chose you, but you can't view yourself as him. You can't view yourself as the one who arranged for you to be the judge. Rather, you have to approach it with even an unbiased vision. Okay, that would be somewhat of an obvious teaching, but that's one possibility. Another possibility is that it's a warning to a judge to be careful how they speak. And this would go with the translation that we have here, that the judge should not play the part of an advocate. A judge has to be careful how he asks questions, what he says during the case, because he could actually lead someone down a path of what would be a good claim to make, right? If the judge says certain things, well, that could give the litigant an idea, if I just make this claim, then I'll win the case. And that claim won't necessarily be true. Now, what might cause the judge to fall into this is the judge might be thinking, these guys, I know who these guys are. They both think that they're right. they're both telling the truth. These two aren't, they're not lying. I know both these guys. They're not liars. They're very upstanding people. And so a judge could become careless in what claims and arguments he throws out in the course of discussion. And it may turn out, well, they're not as righteous as he thought. And one of them will say, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to make that claim, even though it's not true. And then he can win the case with a false claim. So that's why the Mishnah says, it tells the judge, don't be like an advocate, meaning don't let on any advice, any claims that could be a winning argument or could help in someone's argument in the case, because, and it goes on, it says, rather when their litigants are, you might do that if you see them as righteous. When the litigants are standing there before you, you have to imagine that they are the worst, most wicked people in the world. If they will lie through their teeth and they will grab any claim possible in order to win the case, because you don't know whether they would lie, they wouldn't lie. If you imagine them as righteous, you might say the wrong thing. So just imagine them as wicked, and that way you won't come to say the wrong thing. And and
Rabbi Shaps,
yeah,
does it actually say consider them as wicked? So translation I have says consider them as guilty.
it uses the word rishaim.
Okay.
The difficulty is that on that side of the coin it says rishaim, and then when it says, but when they leave, you should view them as zakayin, which means meritorious, doesn't mean righteous.
Okay.
So that's like innocent. So that's why some translators might want to just say, oh, these two words are opposites. One is guilty and one is innocent, but literally translating, one is wicked and one is meritorious. So, okay. Now another possibility, and I think this is relevant for all of us, is that we tell the judge that a person may appear to be meritorious, meaning this person, the judge knows one of the litigants, let's say, or both, and going in, he thinks that this person, this person would never lie, etc. And just that information, that knowledge, or that assumption will affect the judge's ability to judge fairly, and it will affect his perspective and his imagination, etc. And therefore, and in his mind, he'll be advocating for that person, because how could that person be lying? How could, I know this person, he's righteous, etc. So the Mishnah says to the judge, don't be an advocate, in your own head for anybody. Rather, look at them as wicked. You can't come in with a bias because you know that somebody is righteous, and that can impact the judge, and therefore it says you should judge them both. You should assume they're both equally wicked going in, and that way you won't be advocating in your mind for anybody, and you'll be able to judge fairly. However, once they accept the judgment, so then you can recognize again that they're both actually righteous. And this is, I think, something that, even though we're not judging in court, but this happens to us all the time, which is that we're faced with a case. Sometimes it could be ourselves, which we're definitely biased towards ourselves, but it could be just someone that we know is in a given situation. And because we know that person, we assume that they were in the right. And it's hard for us to consider the other side for, that maybe, there's some kind of argument that's going on between two people that we know. One of them we know well, one of them we know we can trust. So in our minds, we automatically say, okay, they must be the ones who are correct here. And and we let this type of bias affect and cloud our judgment. So when approaching any situation where there's two people and we don't know, we may know that one, and we may have a friend, and we know that they're trustworthy, and we may not know the other person as well, but it doesn't mean that we should be quick to judgment and just assume that one is right and not the other. We should be more careful how we judge that. Yes, Ali.
It also could teach us that if we have two friends that have a disagreement, we should stay out of it and let them resolve it. And we're not choosing sides.
Right. That is good advice. Do you see that from here somehow, or you're just adding that as good advice?
No, I see it from here. If you want to take
how?
it down from the judges, if you wonder why it's in here when we're not judges,
right?
Then I take from it that we know people, we could know both of them, but we don't know the whole story.
Right. So you're saying if we were judges and it was being presented to us,
or even not as judges,
right,
just don't choose one friend over another.
I definitely think that's good advice.
But I take it actually, I thought about that when we were studying this one.
Okay, great. Okay,
that's
beautiful.
what I took from it, as not being a judge, but as just a human being in amongst other human beings who have arguments, and
right,
just don't.
Sure.
You don't know.
Very good advice. Okay. Now, in terms of the last line that it says, you should, when they leave, we tell the judge that he should view them as meritorious when they accept the judgment. So over here, it could be that it has to do with how they leave. If a person, nobody wants to lose a court case. Right. And if they lose the case, then they might be upset. So somebody could storm out angry and have a few choice words for the judge on his way out. That person, we're not saying that's not who it's talking about, that you should view them as meritorious. That's not someone who accepted the judgment. That's someone who, if he could, he would flip it back if he had, some way in his power, his or her power. If somebody accepts the judgment of the judges and understands they came to a Jewish court, this is the process, this is the how the Torah law decides the case, so then a person has to accept that. That's the judgment. So if, when the litigants leave, they leave respectfully, they accept the judgment, so then the judge is to view them both as meritorious, despite whatever went into the case. But this is how it's supposed to end. It's supposed to end that they accept the judgment of the court. Now, to move it away from the courtroom, so Rav Moshe Al-Shakar explains this as follows. It actually ties back to one of the interpretations we had in the last Mishnah. A person might start advocating or making claims, playing lawyer in the game of life with God. And the person starts to ask these difficult questions to God. Why do the righteous suffer? Why do the wicked prosper? And that's the connection to the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah said, don't join the wicked, even if you see that they are being successful, they're living a comfortable life. So this Mishnah said, right, we said, don't join them. Now it's saying, and don't start playing judge of or playing lawyer with God and saying, asking these questions of God. And we can ask the question, but we have to accept that we don't know the answer. This is someone who's demanding against God, and then it goes on and it says that when the litigants are before you, they should be viewed as wicked. So what does that mean? So a person sees the righteous suffer. So he says, not fair, right? But we don't really know. We don't know exactly. We don't know what this person has done. It's not necessarily that they're wicked, so to speak, but God has his way that he judges, and a person could be held responsible for something small. This is God who's doing the judges, and it's God who we are sinning against. So we have to accept that somebody who I thought was very righteous may have done something wrong. So that's the line here, that when the litigants are before you, you should view them as rishaim. Not that it's our job to judge people and say, oh, they were punished because they sinned. That's not really our job. But when we're faced with the question, oh, why did this terrible thing happen to someone? So we have to understand that we don't know. We don't know why it happened, but God judges, and God's judgment is fair. And perhaps there's something that they did wrong, or they could have done better, and that's what they're being judged for. So we can view them on some level as rishaim, as somebody who did something wrong, and that's why they are suffering. But when they leave, ultimately, we have to realize that they are zakayim also. They're also meritorious. That's how the Mishnah concludes that a person gets whatever God feels that they are supposed to experience. That's what they experience. And when they leave the world, they'll be moving on to the world to come. God positions them. God allows people to experience that which they need to experience, but that can be a preparation for the world to come. And we realize that when the person moves on, they are moving on to the world to come. So this Mishnah can be read not to be talking to judges in a courtroom, but to us, as judges of life or lawyers of life. Don't start questioning God's judgment. Don't be the advocates for justice as if we know better than God. Rather, when we see the litigants, when we see people in the world that we don't understand why they go through what they go through, it's possible that on some level they did wrong. We can, again, rishaim is a strong word, but it's to bring out the point that they may have sinned against God in some level, in some way, and that's why they experienced what they experienced. It's not our job to judge people, but to understand that God's judgment is perfect. But at the end of the day, when a person is niftar, they move on. That's the language the Mishnah uses when they leave from before you. When they leave the world, we understand that they are leaving zakayim, they are leaving meritorious, having been through whatever they needed to experience in order to have the best experience and meritorious experience in the world to come. Okay. And maybe just one final idea. We didn't really get through all four here. We got through two, but one final idea. So this was a cute one, but a good one, I think. He quotes from Rav Yosef ibn Shushan, who says as follows: the Sanhedrin, the High Court, was arranged in like a half circle. So, but the point is, it was like a special arrangement. So if you go to court, you were arranging the judges, basically. You were getting them to sit in their arrangement. So the Mishnah says, don't be someone who arranges the judges, meaning don't be someone who is constantly causing people to go to court. Don't be someone who is constantly causing the court to have to arrange themselves for a case. Either that could be a case that you're involved with, the Mishnah says, or it could be that someone is kind of an instigator and he or she goes to their friends and says, oh, you should be going to court against so-and-so, and basically a troublemaker. So the Mishnah is saying, don't make a big deal about everything. Not everything has to be litigated in court. Not everything has to be an argument. Not everything has to be a problem. And definitely not everything has to make its way to court. So don't be like Orchei Hadayan, and don't be like those who arranged the court, who caused the court to have to be called to order and to be arranged. Rather to, I guess, chill out a little bit, right? Relax. Not everything has to be cause for argument and dispute. Okay. Fine. I'm not gonna, we'll stop there.
Thanks, Rabbi Shaps.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure.
Night.